Midwest woods are a realm unto themselves, sprawling, secretive, their canopies of pine and oak weaving a tapestry of shadow and silence across the heartland. Here, the earth hums with the rhythm of small-town life, the clatter of a diner's breakfast rush, the drone of cicadas at dusk, the soft creak of porch swings on summer evenings. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lies an older pulse, a primal undercurrent that whispers through the underbrush and rustles the leaves when no wind stirs. For generations, these forests have cradled their mysteries, tales of lost travelers, flickering lights, and shapes that defy naming. In the early 1990s, a scattering of souls, handymen, bartenders, drifters, stumbled into this hidden world, their lives forever scarred by encounters with the Dogman. This is no fanciful yarn spun to spook the young or thrill the idle. It's a raw, unyielding truth etched in blood-soaked earth, splintered wood, and the haunted gazes of those who survived. These accounts form a mosaic of dread, revealing a creature that straddles the line between beast and man, its glowing eyes a harbinger of a terror too vast, too real, to dismiss. Joe Perkins, the handyman's descent into Willow Creek's abyss. Joe Perkins was a man unmoored, his early 30s a restless collage of fleeting gigs, handyman in dusty prairie towns, construction worker on frostbitten sites, always drifting toward the next paycheck to keep his rust-pocked pickup coughing along. In the summer of 1995, he rolled into Willow Creek, a Midwest speck so faint it seemed to flicker on the edge of existence, its clapboard houses and single gas pump dwarfed by a wall of forest that loomed like a living fortress. The job was simple enough. Resurrect an old Victorian house on the town's outskirts, a two-story relic with a roof sagging under decades of neglect, white paint peeling in curls like shedding skin, and a wraparound porch that groaned with every step. The owners, Frank and Diane Grady, were a jittery pair, middle-aged, with eyes that darted to the woods as they handed Joe the keys. "Good luck," Frank muttered, his voice tight, before they hurried off, leaving Joe alone with the house and the oppressive stillness that seeped from the trees. The first week passed in a haze of labor. Joe worked with a quiet focus, prying out rotted floorboards with a crowbar, hammering new planks into place, replacing cracked window panes that rattled in their frames. The forest was a constant companion, its scent of pine and damp earth wafting through the open windows, its shadows stretching cool and long across the porch as the sun dipped low. He savored the isolation. It was a respite from the clamor of his rootless life, a chance to breathe without the weight of expectation. But by the seventh day, the stillness fractured. As dusk bled the sky into streaks of bruised purple and molten orange, Joe paused, hammer in hand, and heard it. A low, rumbling growl from the woods, deeper than a dog's bark, more guttural than a bear's roar, vibrating through the ground into the soles of his boots. He froze, squinting into the tree line where shadows danced in the fading light. Nothing moved, yet the air thickened with an unseen presence, pressing against his chest like a warning. He shook it off. Too many hours in the heat, he told himself, and returned to work, the sound lingering like an echo in his skull. The next morning, he mentioned it to Frank, who'd stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a clipboard. The man's face drained of color, his hand tightening around the thermos. "Be careful," he said, voice dropping to a hoarse murmur. "Those woods, they're dangerous at night, always have been." He turned away, shoulders hunched, as if the words were a confession he couldn't bear to expand. Joe nodded, dismissing it as rural folklore. Every small town had its ghost stories, but the noises grew. Each evening, as the light waned, the growls returned, circling the house like a predator pacing its prey. By the ninth night, they were joined by screams, distant, muffled, piercing through the trees like the cries of something caught in endless agony. Sleep became a battle, the sounds weaving into his dreams, twisting them into visions of yellow eyes and snapping jaws. On the 10th day, curiosity overpowered caution. Joe grabbed his flashlight, its beam a frail spear against the encroaching dark, and stepped into the forest. The woods were a labyrinth, branches clawing at his denim jacket, underbrush snagging his jeans, roots rising like traps beneath the carpet of pine needles. The air was heavy, thick with the musk of decay and resin, and every step echoed in the stillness. The screams grew louder, guiding him deeper until he stumbled into a clearing. At its heart stood an ancient tree, its trunk blackened and gnarled, limbs twisting upward like skeletal fingers clawing at a moonless sky. At its base lay a body. A man, clothes shredded into crimson ribbons, chest torn open, face locked in a rictus of terror as blood pooled in the dirt, dark and glistening. Joe's stomach heaved. He stumbled back, flashlight trembling, the beam jerking across the scene. He turned and ran, branches slashing his face, the forest a blur until he burst onto the porch, slamming the door behind him. He called the police, voice ragged, and within an hour, Sheriff Hank arrived with 2 deputies. Flashlights slicing through the night, radios crackling with static. They searched the clearing, boots crunching on dry leaves. Nothing. No body, no blood, no trace of the horror Joe had seen. Hank, a grizzled man with a tobacco-stained mustache and a squint that missed nothing, studied Joe's face. "Imagination's a funny thing out here," he said, but his tone carried a shadow of doubt, a crack in his skepticism. The nights turned hostile after that. Sleep fled as the growls pressed closer, footsteps creaked on the porch boards, and shadows flickered at the edges of his vision. Too tall, too fluid to be tricks of the light. Joe worked with one eye on the windows, his hammer strikes growing erratic. One evening, as he sanded a kitchen counter under the flicker of a bare bulb, the front door groaned open, hinges shrieking in the silence. He grabbed a wrench, breath shallow, heart pounding against his ribs. A figure stepped inside, tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette filling the doorway. Fur matted its frame, dark and coarse, glinting in the dim light. Its snout was long, teeth gleaming like razors, and its eyes yellow, blazing like twin lanterns. Locked onto him. It snarled, a sound that rattled the windows and shook the floor. Joe swung the wrench with all his strength, striking its snout. It yelped, a cry both animal and eerily human, and staggered back, claws scraping the wood. He bolted out the back door, the wood swallowing him as he ran. The creature's heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind him. Branches snapped, leaves exploded in his wake, and his lungs burned with every ragged breath. Then, abruptly, the pursuit stopped. Joe collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, waiting for claws that never came. The silence was a weight, pressing him into the earth, as if the forest itself held its breath. Dawn found him staggering to the sheriff's office, his story tumbling out in fractured bursts. Hank leaned forward, elbows on his desk, face hardening. "There have been reports for years," he said, voice low. "Folks missing, glimpses of something in the woods. Tall, furred, eyes like that. Never found proof, though. Never wanted to." Joe left Willow Creek that day, the house unfinished, his tools abandoned in the kitchen. He drove until the forest faded in his rearview, but the encounter festered like an open wound. Years later, haunted by those yellow eyes, he dug into the town's past. Yellowed newspaper clippings of vanishings, survivor accounts of a furred beast with a man's posture, whispers of a curse. An old man named Jack, his face creased like weathered bark, shared a tale. A man damned by a witch's wrath in the 1800s, cursed to roam as a monster, preying on the living for eternity. In 1997, Joe returned, driven by a need to end it. Armed with a silver knife and a ritual scrawled in a brittle journal he'd found in the house's attic. He stood in that clearing once more. The ground shook as the creature emerged, its rage a palpable force, its claws slashing the air. Joe plunged the blade into its chest, chanting the ancient words. It howled, body convulsing, fur receding as it collapsed, human-like in death, eyes pleading as it exhaled its last. The curse broke. The town sighed in relief, its vanishing ceasing. But Joe carried the weight of that night, a scar no distance or time could erase, a memory of fur and blood etched into his bones. Will Daniels, the barman's reckoning in the Pacific Northwest. Will Daniels was a linchpin of Pete's Tavern in a Pacific Northwest hamlet, a man pushing 40 who'd worn many hats, mechanic tightening bolts in a grease-stained garage, bartender pouring drafts behind a scarred oak counter, part-time deputy patrolling dirt roads in a battered cruiser. By 1996, the tavern was a sanctuary for the town's tight-knit crew. Sam, a trucker with a grizzled beard and tails as long as the highways he drove. Laura, a waitress with a sharp tongue and a knack for balancing 10 plates. Jimmy, a logger whose booming laugh could rattle the windows. That autumn, the air grew heavy with unease when Eddie Foster, a shy, wiry sawmill worker with a habit of keeping his head down, vanished. The regulars swapped theories over their beers, but Will brushed off Laura's whispers of the Dogman, a local legend of a half-man, half-beast prowler that haunted the woods. Just a story to scare kids, he said, forcing a laugh. Then Jenny Collins, a 19-year-old diner worker with a perpetual smile and dreams of leaving town, disappeared near the old logging road, her car found abandoned with the keys still dangling in the ignition. Sheriff Harland, a broad man with a voice like gravel and a mustache like steel wool, tapped Will for a search party. They trudged through dense underbrush, boots sinking into mud thick with the scent of rot, flashlights carving jagged paths through the gloom. The forest was a cathedral of towering firs and tangled ferns, its silence broken only by their calls. Jenny! Eddie! Swallowed by the trees. Days passed with no trace, the air growing colder, the shadows longer. Will's grandfather's stories clawed at his mind. Tales told by firelight of a creature with glowing eyes and a howl that froze blood. A beast that walked upright like a man but hunted like a wolf. He'd dismissed them as old man's ramblings, but now they gnawed at him, relentless. One night, patrolling alone with a shotgun slung over his shoulder, Will heard a guttural moan, low, pained, seeping from the trees. His flashlight swept the undergrowth, its beam trembling in his grip, and landed on Eddie's remains. The sight stopped his breath. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, flesh torn in precise, bloodless gashes, ribs cracked open like a book left spine up. No bear could do this, no animal he knew. He radioed Harland, voice shaking. "It's Eddie. He's dead. It's bad. Real bad." The sheriff arrived within the hour, his flashlight joining Will's, illuminating the carnage. Harland cursed under his breath, kicking a clod of dirt. "What the hell did this?" he muttered, his usual gruffness fraying at the edges. Will had no answer, only a creeping dread that coiled in his gut like a living thing, tightening with every passing second. The town locked its doors as vanishings mounted. A hunter found gutted near his blind, a pair of hikers gone without a scream. Fear seeped into the cracks of daily life, the tavern's chatter turning hushed, eyes darting to the windows. Years later, in 1999, Jimmy, still the skeptic, stumbled on an unseen cabin deep in the woods while hunting deer. Its walls sagged under the weight of time, ivy choking the frame, strange symbols carved into the splintered wood, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to pulse in the dim light. A trapdoor beneath a rotting rug led to a basement, the air thick with the stench of decay. Bones littered the dirt, some brittle and yellowed, cracked by decades, others disturbingly fresh, marrow glistening in the flashlight's glow. A makeshift altar stood in the center, adorned with trinkets. A silver locket, a cracked wristwatch, a child's hair clip, mementos of the lost. As they stared, yellow eyes flared from the shadows, a snarl splitting the silence like a gunshot. Jimmy fired his rifle, the blast deafening in the confined space. The creature recoiled, blood spattering the wall, and they fled, boots pounding the earth, hearts hammering in their chests. Will found Laura at the tavern, her face pale as he recounted it. "It's real, Laura," he said, voice hollow, hand still shaking. "The Dogman, it's real." The town tightened its grip, doors bolted, curtains drawn, rifles cleaned and loaded. Sheriff Harland's investigation labeled it an unsolved case. The official report citing wild animals, but the townsfolk knew. Whispers grew into a quiet pact. Stay out of the woods, keep the lights on. Will married Laura in 2001, settling into a life shadowed by vigilance. But the memory of those eyes, yellow, unblinking, clung to him, a specter in the corner of every quiet night. Jack, the cabin keeper's last stand in the Midwest. Jack was a wanderer, a man in his early 40s who'd burned through jobs, truck driver hauling freight across endless highways, bartender pouring shots in neon-lit dives, before landing a handyman gig in 1995 at a cluster of cabins in a nameless Midwest town. The cabins sat miles from the nearest paved road, encircled by woods so dense they swallowed sunlight, casting the world in a perpetual greenish dusk. Cabin 5, his favorite, perched at the edge of a small clearing, its porch facing the forest. A perfect perch to watch the stars prick the sky on clear nights. The solitude suited him, a balm to the restlessness that had driven him from city to city. Renters came and went, weekend fishermen, couples seeking a cheap escape. But most days, it was just Jack, his tools, and the rhythmic creak of the cabins settling into their bones. The vanishings began with Ben, a hiker with a friendly grin and a scruffy mutt named Rusty. He'd rented cabin 2, chatting with Jack about the trails over a lukewarm beer. One afternoon, Ben set out with Rusty on a walk, promising to be back by dusk. Hours passed. The sun sank, and Rusty returned alone, whining and scratching at Jack's door, his fur matted with burrs. Jack searched until his voice was hoarse, flashlight beams slicing through the trees. Ben, but found nothing. The sheriff's search party turned up empty-handed, chalking it up to a lost hiker, but Jack's gut twisted with unease. A month later, Claire, a writer from the city, pale and quiet, rented cabin 3 to finish a novel. She vanished under a starlit sky, her car untouched, her notebook left open on the table, ink still wet on a half-finished sentence. The stars are watching. Ted, a boisterous friend from Jack's bartending days, arrived unannounced, his pickup kicking up dust as he rolled in. He laughed off Jack's warnings about the woods. "You're getting soft out here, man," and wandered out one night under a full moon, beer in hand, promising to be back in 10 minutes. 2 hours passed. Jack found Ted's flashlight on the ground near the tree line, its beam still glowing, but no sign of the man. No footprints, no broken twigs, just an absence that gnawed at him. Dread tightened its grip, a cold hand on his spine. He sat up that night, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every rustle, every creak of the cabin's old bones. One midnight, a rustling and growl jolted him awake in cabin 5. He crept to the window, flashlight trembling in his grip, its beam catching the edge of the clearing. 2 glowing eyes stared back. Too high for a man, too close-set for any beast he'd ever hunted, yellow and unblinking in the dark. "Who's there?" he called, voice cracking, the words swallowed by the night. The eyes blinked once, then vanished, the rustling retreating deeper into the woods. Jack stood frozen, shotgun now a constant companion by his bed. Days later, the scratching came, claws gouging the door of cabin 5, a low growl vibrating the wood like a drum. He fired through the door, the blast shattering the silence, a heavy thud echoing outside. He waited, shotgun trembling, until dawn painted the sky gray. The door bore deep claw marks, jagged, deliberate, and a pool of dark blood stained the porch, thick and tacky under the morning light. He followed the trail, shotgun steady, heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It led to a cave hidden by overgrown bushes, the entrance a black maw in the earth. The stench hit first, rotting flesh, damp earth, a rancid sweetness that turned his stomach. Inside, his flashlight swept across a charnel house. Bodies scattered across the dirt, Ben, half his face gone, Claire's pale hand clutching a pen, Ted's frame crumpled like a broken doll. Bones gleamed in the dim light, some cracked and ancient, others fresh with sinew clinging to them. In a corner, the creature slumped, bleeding from Jack's shot, matted fur dark with blood, glowing eyes dimming but still defiant, snout bared in a snarl. It lunged, weak and faltering. Jack fired again, the shotgun's roar ending it. His body crumpled, a nightmare made flesh now still. He stumbled into daylight, the cave's silence deafening, the weight of the dead pressing on his chest. Jack returned to town, voice hoarse as he told the deputy. The man scoffed until he saw the bodies. A team retrieved them, the official story a bear attack, But Jack knew. He left the cabins for good, moving south, the scratching a phantom echo in his restless nights, a reminder of eyes that burned through the dark. Roy Haskins, the Appalachian Nightmare's last echo. Roy Haskins was a jack of all trades in his mid-30s, a man who'd bounced through life, bartending in smoky dives, hammering nails on construction crews, before landing at an Appalachian resort in the summer of 1992. The place was a crumbling relic, its cabins scattered across a mountainside, owned by Mr. Langley, a wiry old man with a permanent scowl and a habit of muttering about wild animals. Roy's days were spent patching roofs and unclogging sinks, the isolation a quiet counterpoint to the clamor of his past. Then a family, a couple with 2 kids, checked into cabin 12, the farthest from the lodge, a squat structure half swallowed by the woods. One morning they were gone. Roy found chaos inside. Clothes strewn across the floor, a teddy bear split open, and scratches gouged into the walls, deep and jagged, too precise for a child's tantrum or a bear's claw. That night, unable to sleep, Roy walked the grounds, flashlight in hand. A massive figure emerged from the trees, part man, part wolf, its fur matted with dirt, eyes glowing yellow in the beam. It snarled, a sound that shook the earth, and lunged. Roy fired his shotgun, the blast ringing in his ears, and dove aside as claws raked the air. He ran, the creature's footsteps thudding behind, and barricaded himself with Langley in the lodge. It clawed at the doors and windows, with splintering under its weight, until dawn silenced it. The lodge bore deep gouges, the ground torn, but the creature was gone. They fled down the mountain, Sheriff Tate skeptical without proof. You sure it wasn't a dream? But Roy knew. Years later, another family vanished from cabin 12, the same eerie echoes rippling through the hills. Roy never returned, the snarls a shadow in his dreams, a memory of a night when the woods bared their teeth. Hank, Nettlewood's reluctant guardian. Hank was a handyman in Nettlewood in 1992. A man in his late 30s with a knack for trouble and a truck that sputtered to life on good days. Helping Thompson repair a barn roof, he spotted a flash of fur in the woods. A quick, unsettling blur. Old newspapers in the library revealed decades of vanishings tied to a wolf-like beast, descriptions chillingly consistent. Tall, furred, eyes that glowed. One night, armed with a rifle, he tracked it to a clearing, its yellow gaze locking onto him, a snarl curling its snout. It charged. He fired, wounding it, the yelp echoing as it fled. Days later, it attacked Thompson, claws slashing his chest. A town hunt cornered it in a cave of bones, human and animal, a grotesque archive of its hunger. After a fierce struggle, they killed it, bullets and blood staining the stone. Nettlewood healed, Thompson scarred but alive, but Hank's vigilance lingered, a quiet watchfulness in his weathered hands. Frank, the night the Johnson boys faced the beast. Frank, a small-town fixture in 1992, joined a search for Sam and Tommy Johnson, 2 boys lost in the woods beyond town. Claw prints and a wolfish humanoid led them to a cabin, its walls rotting, where the creature held the boys, its yellow eyes glinting with malice. Shots and a desperate escape saved them, its howls fading at the forest's edge. The town watched the woods, Frank's rifle a constant companion, knowing the silence might break again. What would you do, reader, if you stood at the threshold of those woods, the air thick with whispers and unseen eyes? Could you bear the weight of their secrets? Or would you flee, leaving the shadows to fester? The forbidden excavation dares you to imagine, because some stories don't end with the dawn. They linger, threading through the dark, waiting for the next soul to listen.